today on the Tearsheet podcast.
There's a real opportunity for a bank, because the loan is completely guaranteed by the SBA, there's a real opportunity for a bank to be a real partner to a business that's in real crisis. And obviously that builds loyalty that you'd like to think would be repaid over the long term.
Welcome to the Tearsheet podcast. I'm Zack Miller. The current COVID-19 crisis presents a massive challenge to the financial industry. And like every crisis, it also presents an amazing opportunity to service customers in an entirely new way. In the U.S., the CARES Act and its Paycheck Protection Program mean banks will need to process approximately 50 times their normal annual loan volume in the next 30 to 60 days. On today's podcast, we talk to UK lending platform OakNorth's CIO, Sean Hunter. Sean and his team have designed an end-to-end solution from application and document collection to pre-screening and forgiveness to help regional and community banks process this insane volume. Sean takes us through the requirements of the various government assistance programs, how banks are dealing with the strain, and how OakNorth built its new capabilities through a process of running its own loan book for its UK challenger bank. Sean Hunter is my guest today on the Tearsheet podcast. I wanted to tell you about Tearsheet's newest online conference, Day-to-Day 2020. Entire financial ecosystems are emerging around financial institutions and large fintech companies with data at its core. We're spending 3 days hearing from top executives at firms like Fiserv, MX, Wells Fargo, Envestnet Yodlee, Plaid, and more about how they are best leveraging customer data to help deliver better products and services. Day-to-Day 2020 is all about data sharing, data aggregation, and personalization. It's about the future of finance. For more information, click on the Day-to-Day conference button at the top of our website, tearsheet.co.
Hi, my name is Sean Hunter. I'm the CIO of OakNorth. So my job is focusing on some of our most important strategic clients and our most important strategic priorities.
So given the crazy world we live in now, Sean, what are those big priorities right now?
Well, right now, our most important focus is on the US programs that have been launched to support businesses during the COVID crisis. So specifically the Paycheck Protection Program and the Main Street Lending Facility.
Great. So, and this is done through OakNorth's platform, right? Like, is it worth distinguishing sort of OakNorth's banking business with the platform business?
Yeah, that's a good point. So in the UK, we're a fully licensed bank. We take retail deposits and do loans focused particularly on small and medium-sized businesses who need debt finance to grow. We do that in a unique way that uses data plus tech to focus on this blind spot that lots of banks have and give them a service that's highly differentiated from other banks. Outside the UK, we do that as a platform business. So we work with banks and try and address that same problem, debt finance to small and medium-sized businesses.
Great. So most of our audience, as you know, is domiciled in the U.S. And so obviously we have a few big government programs coming online to deal with the crisis that's coming out of the COVID-19. Can you talk about maybe what those programs are? And then we can use that as a jumping off point to talk about how OakNorth is set up to help banks in that way.
Sure. So there's a couple of main programs. So firstly, in the US, there was the CARES Act. And under the CARES Act, they launched the Paycheck Protection Program. It's really a short-term program that's designed to help businesses to make payroll in the very, very short term. And it's run by the SBA, the Small Business Administration. And the basic gist of the program is businesses can apply for these PPP loans. Assuming they meet certain criteria, the bank issues them the loan, but then the loan is guaranteed by the SBA. And ultimately, if they spend the money for an approved purpose, which is payroll, then they will get the loan forgiven. So essentially, it becomes a grant if you use it for payroll. You can use up to 25% for mortgage and utilities, but it's basically for payroll. The Main Street Lending Facility is run by the Fed, and it hasn't quite launched yet, and there's not so much noise about it, but it's coming soon. But the Main Street Lending Facility is targeted at a slightly broader reach of businesses, slightly larger loans. The businesses still have to make certain assertions around, that they're not going to have excessive compensation and a few other things, but it's a larger and broader program, and it's run out of the Fed. So I guess that those are the two main programs.
Great. So let's start with the PPP. It sounds like an incredibly ambitious program, right? So you're talking about what, tens of millions of small businesses that are going to now apply to banks, and banks are going to have to process these applications, or even if they're not processing, they have to distribute the money at the end point, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it includes self-employed people and sole proprietorships. So
Wow, so
it's
that's like a third of
incredibly,
America, right?
yeah, it's a massive program. And the PPP one, the first tranche was completely, has already gone and was massively oversubscribed. Everyone is anticipating a second tranche. But even if the second tranche comes, it'll still be, that's currently in, political conversations at the moment. But assuming the second tranche comes, that will also go incredibly rapidly.
So can we talk about sort of the operational onus, I guess, of running the PPP if you're a small mid-sized bank in the US?
Yeah, it's been very intense for small banks in particular. The very, very large banks, the money center banks, they have massive technology divisions and so on, and they can surge to meet this kind of demand. But the smaller banks have just been totally overwhelmed. Lots of them that we've spoken to have been running staff in 24/7 shifts around the clock to try and meet this demand. But obviously, the crisis is very, very challenging for banks in a number of ways, and you don't want to take all your operational staff from the rest of your bank and leave the bank kind of rudderless during this difficult time. So it's been very, very challenging. And basically, the banks they are trying to they don't have to do that much, but the sheer volume, tens of thousands of applications for some of these banks has been hard to deal with. The second is that not all of them were set up for SBA lending. There was an SBA 7A lending program, and some banks were already participating in that program. But if you're a small bank and you weren't doing SBA loans before, getting an SBA credentials, getting authorized to do this PPP lending was challenging in the beginning. The SBA had a lot of technological problems that were delaying things. So you'd have banks with thousands of applications, and each application was taking a human being sort of 45 minutes to an hour to process. So it was very, very difficult.
So how is OakNorth set up to work to help banks, I guess, with the CARES Act?
Yeah, so in a couple of ways. So the one thing is our model is explicitly designed to have humans plus technology.
Hmm.
And so that means we're able to address two of the big challenges. So the first is for PPP banks, we were able to stand up a technology solution very rapidly that allowed them to accept applications. So we can stand up in a matter of hours and have a website that the bank can use to accept PPP loan applications and process them. Then we augment that with some people who do the first level of triage and checking. One of the things we heard from banks we work with is that their operational staff were overwhelmed, but also they were spending a lot of time dealing with applications that could never be submitted because the business person had submitted the owner had submitted the wrong documentation, or didn't have everything they needed in order to apply for the loan essentially. And so what we've done is we've put a team of our people just to do that first level of application triage, so that when the application actually goes to the bank, they have a completed application with all the necessary backing documentation and so on that can be submitted to the SBA immediately.
So software and services, you're helping out your partners there.
That's exactly right.
Um, so you had, I know we're jumping around a little bit, but you had signed a partnership with Customers Bank within the past month, I think it was. Can you talk about what that is and what you're going to be doing with them, if you can?
Yeah, sure. So I think most of this is public. So basically, Customers Bank, we were deploying our normal solution, which is a solution to do mid-market lending to this missing middle segment that I mentioned, who are so overlooked by banks in general. And so that's doing credit analysis and monitoring for these loans. So we supply the credit analysis, the bank decides on whether or not to lend. So we don't decide the loan. And then assuming the bank accepts the loan, then we monitor the loan and help them to do on an ongoing basis very continuous granular monitoring using external data, using technology, using underused and sort of slightly non-conventional data sources and so on. So that's our normal solution. That's what we originally signed with Customers Bank to do. However, in the PPP, they've asked us to also help them process this wave of PPP applications. And so we've also been doing that for them.
It's funny when you guys determined to spin off the platform piece of OakNorth, like you probably had no inkling, I guess, that, something like this would happen so soon or at all, right?
Yeah, it's been remarkable. And the intensity of it all, the last few weeks has been very, very intense, obviously for banks, but also for us, given we're trying to help and there's a lot to do. But one of the other things is it just so happens that our approach using data and analytics has really helped both our bank in the UK and our platform clients to navigate the crisis. Because in the UK, we started doing a COVID vulnerability analysis back in January of all of our loans in our bank. So looking at their supply chain, because if you remember at the beginning, this was a supply chain crisis focused on Wuhan in China.
Mm-hmm.
So we're looking at all our lenders, who's exposed to the supply chain problem, etc. And then as the crisis evolved and became more of a lockdown situation, that's more around the complete absence of demand in the economy. So we're looking at which businesses are able to weather this storm and then reboot afterwards. And as we started doing it for our bank in the UK, we then started doing it for all of our platform clients. And then that's meant that as these US programs have come online, we've actually built a lot of the analytical and sort of intellectual toolkit for assessing COVID impact on a business and looking at its ability to survive and reboot afterwards. And we've actually run something like $30 billion of loans through our platform for this COVID scenario, because, we keep kind of, as the crisis evolves, we redo analysis, we change our parameters, rerun things, and we've built a ton of different COVID scenarios. So we break our, the world of possible businesses down into 1,600 granular subsectors. And then for each of those subsectors, we've built a domain model that sort of specifies how the finances of that business would work. So the finances of a manufacturing business are completely different from the finances of a hospitality business, for example. But if you look at some of these subsectors, they kind of relate. So, how a Airbnb let, for example, would respond to the COVID crisis is quite similar to how service departments would respond, right? And so we've got a few different COVID scenarios that we run for each of these businesses to say, okay, given this granular subsector that you're in, how do businesses in this subsector get affected by the lockdown? And then what does a reboot scenario look like for them? And so we've been running sort of 3, 6, sometimes now even 9-month scenarios for a lockdown duration to see which businesses can manage to weather the storm and then reboot afterwards.
It's so interesting, the interplay that you have between running your own bank and then pushing that out to the platform. Has that come to fruition, I guess, in other ways, or is that just a model that works really well, that you guys actually, because you have your own loan book and can deal with these things, that whatever you build for yourself, you can push out to your customers as well?
Yeah, it's incredibly helpful. I mean, it's helpful in a number of different ways. The first one is it means when we talk to banks, we really understand what they're going through. Obviously, every country is different, every bank's a little different, but we really know how credit works. We know how loans should be monitored and so on. And we know what regulators need because we have to deal with our own regulator. One of the things we do run very carefully, we're very careful to avoid conflict of interest between our bank and our platform. So we're never in competition with our own clients. In the UK, we're only ever a bank. We don't work with other UK banks. And outside the UK, we're only ever a platform. We don't lend on balance sheet outside the UK. In order to avoid problems, but it really helps. So it means when we go to a bank, we really know what they're going through, understand how they think about things, and can really help them.
And you just signed another agreement in the U.S. with Modern Bank. Do you want to tell us about that one?
Yeah, so Modern Bank is is a bank based in New York City, and we're very happy to work with them. Again, we're working with them on the PPP, and it's enabled them to do what a lot of banks, a lot of large banks really struggle to kind of take new lending during this crisis, and they've attracted a lot of criticism. But it's literally just because of the operational intensity that I mentioned before. It's very hard for banks to also add on top of that, trying to do a sort of KYC check and knowing the customer and all that stuff at speed. And so what a lot of banks have done is they've said, we're only going to service our existing customers. Whereas with Modern, we've helped them to service a much larger number of customers than they might otherwise have done during this crisis.
Interesting. And the model, I guess, going forward, I guess in the U.S. specifically, is continue to sign agreements like you did with customers and Modern. Do you have other? What does the pipeline look like, I guess, during this crisis?
Yeah, so we've got about 7 banks we're working with in the US. They're wide ranging from some of the largest banks down to, relatively small banks like Modern. Um, just Modern and customers have gone public, which we're very grateful for. But some of the other banks, we're working with them, but they don't want to be public yet. The one thing I would say is that um, the nature of our engagements with these banks does vary. So for some banks, we're just doing PPP, and that's fine. For other banks, they're really interested in us helping on Main Street, for example. And it's possible that from Main Street, there's an on-ramp to doing kind of our normal platform offering. And so there's a full range of how we're engaging with banks.
Sean, do you expect other programs, both in the U.S., the U.K., and I guess other countries that you service to come online that you guys would participate in?
Yeah, definitely. So I mean, we're in the UK. We're participating in the CBILS program, which is conceptually similar to the PPP, although it has some differences of implementation because it's not a grant; it's more of a loan, but with certain specific parameters. As a bank and they're talking to banks elsewhere. I spoke to one of the very largest banks in Germany, just like programs that are happening there. Um, and I'm, speaking to a bank in Australia at 6 a.m. tomorrow morning about the government programs that are on there. I think banks globally, there's a sort of external perception that banks aren't responding fast enough to this crisis. However, I think banks are trying to do as much as they can. They're just not really set up to move this rapidly. And I think a lot of banks are wary of, what happened in the 2008 crisis, where post facto, there was a lot of investigation, a lot of sort of finger pointing about actions that were taken, and so they're trying to be more cautious and thoughtful because they don't want to, do something wrong now, but it's slightly harming their ability to respond quickly.
Do you think there's a reckoning here that's also going to happen? Meaning, if you're a smaller mid-sized bank and don't have the resources to participate, and you sort of disappoint your customers, or you lose an opportunity to bring in new customers, like, are the big going to get bigger here?
I think there's that. I think that's a very valid concern.
Mm.
And because honestly, if you think about this situation, so take the PPP. There's a real opportunity for a bank, because the loan is completely guaranteed by the SBA. There's a real opportunity for a bank to be a real partner to a business that's in real crisis, and obviously that builds loyalty that you'd like to think would be repaid over the long term. I think likewise the Main Street program, which a lot of banks just don't have the operational capacity for. They're kind of waiting to see what happens, but in actual practice, there's a very short window before the program gets launched. It's probably going to get started around, sometime this week. And as a consequence of that, again, it gives the bank an opportunity to really be a partner to a business in crisis, and then hopefully that builds long-term relationships. But as you say, these small and medium-sized banks, they can't really take advantage of that opportunity, and so it may well be that the large banks sort of gobble up all of the opportunity that's on the table.
Sean, this was incredibly informative, and really enjoyed talking to you. Thanks for joining us on the Tearsheet podcast.
You're most welcome, Zach. It's been great talking to you.